It is my privilege to introduce our plenary today. Tyler Technology presents Unlocking the Power of Data and AI for Court Efficiencies. Harness the power of data analytics and AI to optimize your court operations while reducing administrative burdens. Leverage valuable insights for strategic, data-driven decision-making and generate revenue by maximizing the value of your data. Learn how to build an external and internal program to structure and protect your data and make it accessible to authorized stakeholders. Hear what your peers in the court industry are doing and the best practices for utilizing automation to create safe and meaningful benefits for the justice system. So I need some folks from Tyler to come on up and get us rolling. There they are.
Hey,
It's good to go.
yes, sir. Thank you.
Perfect.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I want to start off by just saying, this conference is fantastic. I had an opportunity to come in early yesterday and sat in a few classes and was just extremely impressed with the content and some of the speakers that we're sharing. So privileged to be here. We're always thrilled to be a part of speaking at NACM. And so I want to introduce myself. My name is Terry Derrick. I'm the general manager of our courts business for the Courts and Justice Division. I oversee our enterprise justice platform, our data partnerships, our analytics programs, and our jury systems. I'm also going to share Ellen, and I'm going to ask Ellen Reed, who's my co-presenter today, to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be back here. I've been to some NACM conferences before and even spoken at a plenary before, so it's great to do that again with you. I work with the data and analytics piece of Tyler, and specifically with the justice data. So I run a team that works specifically on justice analytics. So it's always a real pleasure to get to speak to you all at the conference. I would love to get a chance to connect more with many of you. My background is really in the legal world. I worked as a paralegal. I worked with pro bono programs. I worked with the legal regulatory system, the Bar Association. So I have a lot of background that I bring to it that makes me really care about how data is used in the courts, and I'm really excited to share some of the ways that we think AI can enhance that today.
Great. Thank you, Ellen. So we're going to try to do a few things today, and our goal is to try to demystify AI. When you ask about what is AI, it can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people, a lot of use cases. So we'll try to simplify that down and get it down to a level that we can understand and then maybe implement moving forward. And then we'll provide some practical use cases that are live and in the field today on how other courts across the country have implemented AI to get tangible and material results. Before we do that, I just kind of want to level set with this group on a couple of items. The first one is just a question. And just by a show of hands, how many of you are excited about implementing an AI solution in your court or office? Okay. So our goal today is that we have a few more hands by the end of this presentation. All right, so just to kind of maybe take a step back and talk about a problem that I think a lot of us are probably facing today, and it's around employment and the employment shortages specifically as it pertains to the courts and justice space. When you talk about unemployment in the United States, we're at an all-time low of about 3.9%. So those that want to get a job are able to get a job. And when you look at that, the chart, so when you look at the chart there, you can actually see the COVID impact of that particular moment where the unemployment skyrocketed and then it started to work itself back down. But as you go through and look at the particular government sector, the growth has been fairly stagnant. So the growth rate hasn't hit the government space as much as it has the other industries. Furthermore, when you go in and talk about the labor participation in the United States, the labor force participation is also at historic lows. And so the labor force participation is the percentage of people who are in the labor force. So fewer number of people are needing jobs and even fewer number of people are without. But when you start to talk about the government space is fairly broad. and it actually includes more than just state and local government. The majority of local government jobs are actually teachers. And so when you take that into consideration, the majority of the return that's come back from COVID and that bounce back is not in actually state and local government. It's actually in the education industry. And so when you look at the criminal justice space, you see that we have widespread shortages in terms of our labor force. In fact, labor shortages are abound in criminal justice. I'm going to take a moment for just a second. In my job, I get to travel around the country. I get to visit jails and courts, and most of the time it's for business reasons. But I did get a chance. There you go. I told my kids I would tell that joke. So I did get a chance to meet with one of our larger courts and one of the supervisors there, and I asked them about the situation. They gave me a quote, and I wanted to read it to you guys. It says, "We're losing our existing resources due to higher paying positions, work from home flexibility, and the quantity of work being too intense. In the past, we opened positions, we would have over 200 applicants, and now we're lucky to get even 20. Many of those are not qualified or have issues that prevent us from hiring them. In addition, the good staff that I do have is being moved within the county to higher paying positions. And counties have started to change their practices around hiring and began holding job fairs, which is helping, but it's still not enough." That's an actual quote from one of your peers. So this is a problem that we're all facing today. And when we look at a recent poll that was issued, and the results of that poll, it showed that 75% of Americans were stressed because of the amount of work that they had. And another 60% said that they couldn't keep up because they had too much on their plate. So we've got a real problem in this space, and there's a significant productivity gap that we're faced with. And so what's the answer to that? Can AI help, right? Is it the answer? I don't know if it's the absolute answer. I think to answer that question, we got to understand what is AI, right? And understand when we talk about artificial intelligence, what is it we're truly actually talking about? So let's step into it. What is AI? Is it magic? I don't think so, right? In fact, as a technology expert and with 20 years of courts and justice experience, I don't think that AI is magic. In fact, there's some really common use cases that I think can be applied with just artificial intelligence. It's the more that we understand what it is, the practicality of it, we can then begin those. So how do we, if we know that it's not magic, how do we demystify that? How do we simplify that down into practical terms? So I think you have to go back in time, and I'll kind of age myself here. This is going back to fourth grade fractions. My daughter is about to go into fourth grade, so I'm going to get to experience this all over again. But when we started off with fourth grade fractions, it was kind of the first step in understanding numerical values in mathematics at a different level, more than just addition and subtraction, multiplication and division. And so we start thinking about fractions and how that works. If you take a set of die, a single roll has a probability of about 16.6%. It's basically 1/6 of a roll. It's every face that it can be divided by the number of faces that are available. So pretty simple. We then took the statistics that we had based upon the fractions and then moved on to statistics, which is actually the next step. So this is the normal statistics that you would see, the median, the mode, the mean. If you use that same scenario where you have the different die and you try to put that into an average number, the mean here, what you would actually get is 3.5. You take all of the possibilities and you add them up at the rolled values, which is 21. You divide it by the number of possibilities, which is the number of faces on the die, to get 6. And 21 by 6 is 3.5. So you get your average. Starting to progress through this. As we take a step further, we go into regression, which just basically estimates the relationships between the dependent variable and the independent variable. And another way of saying it in a simplified way, it's just a chart with a lot of dots and a regression line. And what that regression line indicates is the trend line of where it's projected to move forward. So it's basically predicting the future versus observations of past data to know, are we actually moving upward Are we moving neutral, or are we moving downward? So then we started to progress even further. In the introduction of the digital age, we started introducing computers to start handling some of this work. So we moved from maybe a TI-83 calculator to actually computers. Hopefully some of you got that one. When you introduce computers, then we changed the name again. Now it's called data science, which I think is really a cool term. I mean, I've always wanted to be called a data scientist. I always thought that was probably one of the coolest titles that's out there. But really what we're talking about is we're leveraging computers now to do these calculations for us so that we can better appreciate kind of where we're headed. What it does is the computer then predicts the numerous variables that are at play, and then it uses that to predict the future outcomes. So we're kind of progressing down this model even further. Then we started calling it machine learning, right? Which is, we're getting newer names every time that we make this step. And in machine learning, it's just taking all of the data and making future predictions, but it's also now taking the outcomes of those results, injecting them back into the data model, and then using that to predict future forecasts. So it's updating its forecast based upon how it's actually evolving in the outputs of the results that we're getting. So it refines those predictions over time. Now we've then transitioned from what we were talking about from simple basic fractions now to what we call artificial intelligence. And it seems to be everywhere, right? If you look around, though, you hear people saying robots are doing this, robots are doing that. But one thing that I probably wouldn't think that a robot would be doing would be sitting on your couch watching television, right? You probably don't see that. You do see robots and AI behaving in certain ways and different technologies. You know, you may have a self-driving vehicle like a Tesla that can navigate from point A to point B semi-autonomously. Or you may even have something that I've got, which is a little Roomba vacuum cleaner that can map out your house and navigate around and do some vacuuming. You know what, now that I think about that, maybe the robot is actually watching TV. Maybe it's the Roomba that stops right in front of my TV in my living room. But we've started to see AI get injected into all sorts of different use cases and technologies. One is inside of television sets. So we've gotten, if you remember back in the day, we went from standard definition to 420p to 1080i to 1080p to 4K. Now we're up to 8K. We may even be higher than that, but you're starting to see televisions do what they call upscaling. So they take a source, which is the signal that's in a lower format, and they upscale it to make it look better. So we've got 8K TVs, even though there's very, very little content with 8K, using artificial intelligence. But it goes further than that. They actually have even created washers and dryers that have artificial intelligence to show you that your clothes are perfectly washed and they're just the right amount of dry for you to pull them out of the dryer. One more step is they even have them in beds now to tell you that you're in that perfect REM model of sleep and shouldn't be woken up. And if you do and you feel a little groggy, but it's probably because your AI is telling you that you need to, right? All kidding aside, when you look at just AI, what is AI? Ultimately, it just comes down to probability and statistics, right? So it's not something that's scary. It's just taking an understanding of mathematics and the complexity of it and using technology to help us better understand it so that we can make data-driven decisions. So when you think about the progression that we've gone through, where you start off with fractions, then you go to statistics, then you go to regression, data science, machine learning, and then eventually AI, you can kind of see us on a chart where the left side of the chart is the amount of data. The horizontal axis is the math complexity. So as we've gotten more data and we've gotten the ability or the tools to handle the complexity of math, you start to progress up. Now, in this progression, it doesn't happen overnight. It's not something that, you just wake up and we become now in generative AI, which is the next step in this process. It actually takes some time to get there. And each of these cycles takes about 20 years, but they do overlap with each other. So as you come to the conclusion of one cycle, you start to get into the beginning of the next cycle. And so right now, we're at the end of that machine learning cycle and somewhere in the first half of that AI cycle. And so we're starting to learn a little bit more about how we can use AI and what kind of use cases those would be applicable to. Today, we want to talk about some of those use cases and the practicality that we've implemented with some of our partners, like the City of New York or the United States Army or Palm Springs, Florida. So we'll talk about some of these use cases and how these partners have implemented them to make a material impact on their business. Before we do that, I think there's just a process that we like to use, and I'm going to kind of kick us off, and then I'll pass it over to Ellen so she can elaborate a little more. But we like to make decisions based upon data. That gives us a really good indicator of how we move forward. There was a class I took at Stanford that talked about adult learning, and it talked about specifically using your instinctual system, which is your gut, and then using your intuitive system, which is your data, right? And so if you combine those two, sometimes you have a gut feeling that says you should probably go do this. It's a really good indicator that that's probably the right direction, but it's because you've actually experienced some of those things historically that's maybe tucked really, really down deep in your brain. And so it's important for you to use your intuitive system to pull out the data to be able to then reference, is this the right move? Even though my instinct is telling me that it should, is this the right move that we should take? And so what we do at Tyler is we start making data-driven decisions by a 4-step process. And the first step is really just implementing a course of action. So you do something. The second step is then you collect data upon the results of that action. And in this step on the top right here, it's important for you to pull the data out using a tool that gives you the ability to then slice and dice and look at it in multiple ways. Because the next step is you evaluate the data. Without having the data in the proper format or the proper tool so that you can view that information, it's very difficult for you to look at it from different perspectives. Why it's important for you to look at it from different perspectives is because your perspective may not be the perspective of someone else. And so if you're a court administrator and you're looking at data, try to look through the lens of the judge. If you're a clerk, try to look at it through the lens of a legal professional. And it may alter how you're looking at that data. Don't be afraid to be inquisitive, because this is the part where you start asking questions about the data and you'll glean some valuable insights. The third step is that once you've done that, determine a course of action. Create a strategic and tactical plan for how you would execute on the data that you had based upon the outcomes that you desire. And then you look for the help of tools, again, AI, to help you with that. So if you don't really understand maybe the next step and you need some suggestions, you can go plug it into ChatGPT and say, hey, here's my data set. I'm looking for this outcome. Can you give me some suggestions? And it can give you some responses. Again, use that as a tool, not as the wholesale direction, but it's guidance. It's a suggestion for you to consider as making that decision. And then finally, implement that course of action. And then do it with precision and make sure that you're doing it very well and methodical, and doing so that you can collect the data of that decision so that you can start the process all over again. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Ellen. She's going to talk a little bit about how Tyler views AI, and then maybe go into some of the use cases that we've done so. Thanks, Ellen.
All right, so one of the biggest things here, let's see if I can get the slides to change. Yes, all right. One of the biggest things here for us at Tyler is really just figuring out how can we make sure that we're using AI safely, that we're using it well, that we're separating kind of this big narrative of AI is going to take over everything from the really practical things that it can do today, and really understanding too what it can't do today, because there is a lot of things that it can't do today. So we've been having a working group convening for quite some time now, where we're really focusing on just separating those concepts and really understanding how we can bring value to our clients by using AI, and where it might not show as much promise. So when we get into this, we're really getting into it not just with our clients, with conversations with you, but we're also getting into it with our technology partners. So Google, AWS, Microsoft, and really working with them to understand what happens when we use your models. Where does the data go? Is any of it being collected? Really just understanding all of the edges, all of the legal ramifications, because what we want to make sure is that it's easy for you to use AI responsibly in your systems and to use it transparently and openly. One of the things that I grew up with was if you're doing something and it's a secret, it's you probably shouldn't be doing it. And that was a core lesson. And I think that's really true when it comes to AI. If you're using it in a transparent, clear way with your workforce, if you understand what it's doing, you can use it really responsibly and really well. If it's not easy to understand what it's doing, if it's not easy to understand how it's being used or where it's being used, then it probably needs to be re-examined. So we're really diving into that at Tyler and really understanding it as deeply as we possibly can, and then making sure that we're reflecting that understanding out to our clients. Ooh, hold on, there we go. There it is, all right. So there's sort of three main areas where we have decided there really is strong promise with AI in terms of what we can bring to especially the court system, but all of the different clients Tyler works with. So one of the main things, as you might imagine, and I'm guessing that a lot of those hands that raised around excitement about AI and using AI in the courts were related to this first one, productivity. There are just a lot of routine tasks that happen day to day in the justice system. And the basic thing to think about when you're examining, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later on too, but when you're examining your own systems and thinking, where can I use AI? It really comes down to, is there a little rule set that's being followed by my staff? Are they looking up in one corner of the screen and up in another corner of the screen and then, clicking yes? Are they doing something like that that feels routine, that has a very specific set of actions that are being taken? And then if so, do we really need a human to do that? Or can that potentially be done through task automation? So that's definitely a huge area where we see a lot of opportunity, and we're really working with building some task automation into our products. And again, in terms of how we're working with our clients, we're really trying to figure out, where do you need to save time? Where do you need to save that valuable human touch resource that your staff can bring? And you don't necessarily need to have a human do this particular task. One other big piece of it, and I'll get really into this because it's an area I'm really passionate about, and Terry did a great job describing the cycle of how this works, is decision making. And that really comes down to data-driven decision making. So making your data accessible, understandable, and making it easy for you to ask questions of your data, essentially, and get answers back, so that then you can proceed to chart that course of action, to collect your results, and to really understand, as you go through different experiments with processes, is this working? Is this not working? Setting up key performance measures, and always being able to, again, kind of reflect that clarity around, this is the outcome we expect. Here's the data that shows us whether or not we're achieving it. And here's the process we're going to follow to try and get to that outcome. And then finally, service delivery. So there's a lot of things when it comes to navigating the court system, understanding where to go for different things, that we see there's going to be some opportunities for things like chatbots or things like content generation to be able to really assist the court. It can be hard sometimes to keep up with the amount of information that you need to push out to the public. That's really just pretty straightforward, court is closed today, hearings have changed from this room to this room. So we're exploring how we can help by having that automated generation of text that can be pushed out, rather than having an individual have to write every specific thing that gets put out there. But again, as we look at all of these, one thing I'll stress continuously is that everything is a partnership between artificial intelligence or any computer that you're using, any computer program, and a human. So we really want to see and help encourage a partnership across the board between your staff and the technology that they're using, because just one alone is not as strong as the both together. All right, so we're going to dive into some very specific examples. And as I talk about this first one especially, I just really encourage you to think of ways that this might apply in your court. This is just one example, but there are a million, and I would love to talk to you individually more about them throughout the course of the conference. But this is an exciting one from West Virginia. So in West Virginia, they were having an issue. There we go. In West Virginia, they were having an issue where public defenders were needing to be reimbursed by the state. And there were a set of rules that needed to be followed in order for those reimbursements to be issued. And West Virginia started experimenting with AI reviewing the public defender's applications for reimbursement and saying, hey, can we actually automate this process, make it go faster? Because again, this was a place where it wasn't necessarily required for a human being to look at all of the documents. There was a set of rules and policies that need to be followed. They could have that automated process happening that checked for those rules and policies and whether or not they were being followed. And then they could go ahead and then issue the reimbursement or not issue the reimbursement. And so far, I think this experiment's only been going on for several months now, but thus far they've been able to automate about 20% of the reimbursement requests, which is cutting down really significantly on the employee hours. And my understanding is that would probably be quite a bit higher, except that, again, as they're being very responsible, as they're being very careful, they're testing this process and they're keeping an eye and spot checking those reimbursements to make sure that they're accurate. So there's even more promise here for how much can be automated as they go forward. So again, as we really start experimenting with AI, what we're going to be encouraging and what I think most of the experts that you hear talking about AI at this conference will be encouraging is really having, again, that partnership between a human staff member and an AI so that you can just be really confident that these tasks that you're starting to automate are happening correctly, and then getting that sort of spot checking, that oversight process in place allows you to start maybe a bit slowly, but then really ramp up your use of AI as it becomes trusted, as it becomes understood, and as everyone really gets a great bead for where it really works in your court system. My next one, and this is really, again, where I am very passionate, is data and analytics. So data and analytics, I know, are really extensively used in some courts. Other courts don't use them as extensively. But this is really my day job, is trying to figure out how to make them easy and accessible and relevant to use for the courts. And I am so excited about what AI might be able to do for us here. So as I talk to clients about data and analytics, there's a ton of barriers that get in the way of using data in the courts. You guys, I'm sure, all know them and could elaborate with many painful stories about them. But one of the biggest ones is that the data tends to be siloed in our systems. We have a lot of different technology systems that we use in the courts, and the data can just kind of be stuck in one particular place for each independent system that you use, and it's very, very hard to bring it together. It's also very just hard to count in the court system. Sometimes when I talk to people who aren't in the court system about this, they're going, why is it hard to count cases? Why is it hard to count how many cases are active? You really have to have an understanding of the complexity of case processing in order to know why it is hard to produce these statistics. But every court essentially does it a little bit differently for the most part, and it gets very, very hard at the ground level to say, this is exactly how many active cases we had, this is what the time to disposition was. So that can really be a barrier for courts because it can be discouraging to have so many different ways to understand something as simple as how many cases are open and active right now. It can be very hard to have the time and resources for a data program. In the court system, one of the speakers earlier was mentioning it here. There's safety issues. There's a lot of stressed out people walking in the door. There's a lot of day-to-day management of just making sure that trials can run, hearings can happen. There's so many things that take our time and attention that require a human touch, that require a calm, helpful, friendly face. And so having time where you're off in the corner working on your spreadsheets doesn't always seem the most important thing that you can do. Even though I think most people probably agree that data is valuable and interesting, it doesn't always feel like the thing to do with your Tuesday or your Wednesday. So it can be very, very difficult to kind of just get the time and resources together to even start a data program. And then when it does start, often getting it to the point where everyone understands the data that you're working with and where people see a chart or they see a spreadsheet and it feels relevant, it feels meaningful to them. It can also be very, very hard, right? How often have you looked at an Excel spreadsheet and been like, yeah, totally, that's it. It really takes time and understanding to get to the point where you're feeling like that data reflects the picture of your day-to-day work and helps you to make meaning out of that work and to make plans based on your work. So when we look at AI, the biggest thing that I'll talk about here, I'm going to really describe what's on the screen and talk about kind of what we see from a product perspective. But what we get down to in terms of how we think that courts want to use data is most people in the court system want to be able to ask a question and get an answer. That would be much nicer than trying to extract data from a system, trying to interpret that data, trying to put that data in an understandable format. And that's where we think AI can really help us. We think that AI can help us extract data from systems. We think that AI can help us put it into natural language and understandable terms. We think it can help us story tell with our data, put that data into visualizations, put that data into charts that are meaningful and interesting for people. So what I'm showing you on the screen right now is a beta version. So, apologies to any of my analytics clients out there. You're not going to see this today in your product, but you might see it sometime very soon. I won't pick a specific date yet, but you might see it sometime very soon, depending on how our beta testing finishes out here. But something along these lines, I think, is really kind of the future of what we're looking at. And so I want to really explain it in pretty intense depth here for you. So what you're seeing on the screen is a representation of current software. So we have data sets and data domains that we offer that essentially create data lakes for our clients. So that's where we see that first issue that I talked about of these data silos, where you can't get data from one system to talk to data in another system. That's one of the big pieces that we work on a day-to-day basis, is creating these small data lakes for courts or for other public safety agencies, for different justice partners, that allow them to bring data into one place and get it all into a usable format. All have it cataloged, very well described, and basically to have it be accessible, searchable, and really usable ultimately. So what we have developed so far is we have these data sets that live in this domain, this data lake, and the AI models can already do a great job coming up with great questions to ask of the data. So the AI models will crawl through the data and they will find interesting outliers. They will find points of sort of the data looking like there is some sort of insight to be gleaned from it. And it will present those questions to you so that you can then go in and explore the data. So that's one fun feature that, again, we're now experimenting with and we're finding is pretty interesting and really kind of helps people get to know their data. We also have what comes out to be natural language answers. So usually if you ask a question potentially of your data, if you get in and you query your data from a database, for example, you'll get back essentially a spreadsheet or an extract of your data that you then have to go interpret and usually work quite a while to get into a usable format. This is actually able to just give you an answer to the question. So if you say, how many active cases do I have as of X date? It should tell you there are 372 active cases in your family law department or whatever you asked. That is going to be, again, something that we hope will make the data much more accessible, much more understandable, because there are a lot of people who are not willing to manipulate a spreadsheet that are willing to ask a question and get an answer. And again, not having to interpret that answer, not having to really dive in and pull things apart, we think is going to change the game in terms of who's willing to use data and how they're willing to use data. And then finally, we want to make sure that these results can be clear and understood. So as I talked about earlier, no secrets. We don't really want to develop a bunch of algorithms that you don't understand or that you can't access, that you can't use to explain what you're actually giving back, especially if you're doing things like public records requests or anything like that with a feature like this. So we're always going to display the actual query that's being run so that you can then, again, validate, hey, this AI model is doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing, and it's giving me the results that I need. So with all of those, again, we want to break down the data silos. We're bringing your data into one place. We're allowing that data to be searched proactively, all of your different data to be searched proactively at the same time. We can do things like code mapping much, much faster with a service like AI, with the large language model, because it can go in, suggest code mapping or respond to a subset of code mapping that you provide, and then map data across different systems, which we think is going to be a really promising way to remove, again, a lot of human time from things like the code mapping process. There are ways in which it can really help describe data. So hopefully, again, getting to that point where you aren't spending ages trying to get a data program going. The data that's in the system is already well described, and then it's easy for someone to understand. It's easy for a new data analyst to get ramped up, and maybe someday it's even easy for your judges to get in and start using this as well. And then finally, you really end up having what ultimately could potentially be something where you would allow even the public to access something like this, where they could ask their own questions of the data that you put out, and they could get their own answers, hopefully saving time on things like public records requests. And again, that's all quite a ways in the future, right? No one's going to put that into your system without you asking. It's essential that you know and understand your data before it kind of is out free in the wild. But all of that said, we do see a lot of promise here for just making data programs accessible and relevant and really, really easy to use for everyone in your system, and then potentially longer term for the public as well. So I'm really excited about this. I think it's going to change the game in terms of data analysis. And really, like we talked about at the beginning, take it from, hey, we need to invest a ton of time and resources into getting a data program going, into a state where you can really say, hey, we are going to invest some time and resources in getting a data program going, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But we're also going to end up in a position where we can ask a question and get an answer. And that's a really different position to end up in than, hey, at the end of this, we're going to have to still do a lot of time creating charts, creating analysis. It just changes the game in terms of the output. So one of the other big things that this is going to be able to do that we really see as essential is help you storytell with your data. So annual reports, working with stakeholders, working with justice partners. It's going to be very easy with these AI models to create charts and visualizations. And again, even with reports, even if you write a report that summarizes all your data, the problem with reports is they have words in them. And no one likes reading those, as we know. So we really want to make sure, again, that you can put the data into an understandable format, make sure that it's going to speak to people instantly. And we know, again, that in the justice system, if we don't tell the story of our data, someone else will, and they'll probably get it wrong. So having the ability to create these charts, these visualizations that can be used by anyone in the justice system, that can be used by the public, we think it's a real game changer for how your data can be used to build trust, how your data can be used to build understanding, and how your data can be used internally to experiment successfully with processes and with different ways of changing how you relate to your work. All right, I'm going to pass it back to Terry for another set of examples.
Thanks, Ellen. So I want to talk a little bit about data entry and documents. A large portion of what artificial intelligence is really leveraging robotic processing automation, which is RPA. All that means is we're using robots to actually perform tasks that are really methodical and simple to do, instead of using individuals like myself or other humans. When you talk about document processing and automation, the courts spend a significant amount of time doing court and document management, docketing the information that's being filed. And when you kind of walk through this process, and I'll do it at a high level and then go into the details, but you see the filings typically come in a either over-the-counter method where the clerk then goes in, and you probably are familiar with this process more than I, but they make copies of it and then they bonk with the timestamp, right? And then they put one in the file folder and they put that in a specific box for another clerk to come pick up, and then they give the other one back to the individual who filed it. In jurisdictions where they don't have mandatory e-filing, or they allow self-represented litigants to file over the counter, that's typically the case. But the magic doesn't stop there. The work doesn't stop there. When that document gets put into that location or the box for the next clerk to pick up, that's when the next step happens. The clerk picks it up and then takes it back and then reviews what was filed, and then typically does some other steps in the process. Maybe they go in and add a time standard or a time tickler to track the statute of limitations on the case. Or perhaps they go in and schedule a hearing and send out hearing notices, right? The same could be said whenever the documents come in through an electronic format. So when they're electronically filed and they either come in as a PDF, a TIFF, or maybe even a Word document, they get automatically docketed into the court's case management system, but there's still that workflow that needs to take place afterwards. So they have to be manually reviewed, then they have to go in and perform that subsequent activities, which is time intensive, it's error prone, and it just can be simplified. So if you walk through that process today, then the document's electronically filed, it gets docketed, but a person then goes in and reviews that information, then they make the decision as to what next steps need to occur, and they go in and they actually do those next steps in the case management system. By introducing large language models, again, we're going to use a lot of terms here, but by introducing another form of AI, you can simplify that process. You can extract out the text from within the document, and then you can use artificial intelligence to understand and score the content that's within so that it can, if it has a high enough confidence rating, go in and perform those subsequent activities or tasks that a normal individual would do and complete that work instead of having the individual do it. If they run into problems along the way, they can deliver it back to a queue where a clerk can pick it up and finish that out. So this model of going through and doing this is something that we've implemented. What we've implemented with a couple of our partners is twofold. We started the process on the electronic filing side, where when the documents are electronically filed, we have our robots go in and they review the filing information and they compare it to what's contained inside of the document. And they cross-reference those. And if they're not right, it makes changes. You see, in electronic filing, many states implement it in a way that simplifies the filing process by having a finite set of filing codes that are exposed to the filing community member, right? A lot of times the filing community member doesn't really care how it's docketed inside of the case management system. They just want to file that motion and make sure it gets in front of the judge. So we simplify that on the front end, but on the back end, the clerks, while they're reviewing those documents, are making the changes on how they want it to be docketed in the case management system, because that's an important step. That typically kicks off that workflow for the next step or sets of activities that happen thereafter. So our system will go in and review that information, compare it, make those determinations. It'll also go in and accept that filing. It'll move the file stamp to a location that doesn't overlay other text within the document, so you don't get that awkward area where this file stamp is over the text of the document and difficult to read, and then it sends it to the case management system. The second step is then it goes into the case management system and then does the subsequent activities based upon the data that was contained within that document. So it'll go in and add workflows, it'll go in and schedule hearings, it'll send out notices. We've implemented this in a couple of jurisdictions across the country, but two that I really want to bring up to you. One was Tarrant County. Tarrant County implemented this and won the National Association of Counties National Achievement Award for their productivity with this implementation. Because they implemented, they were able to proactively identify errors and extrapolate that information and then return it back for correction during the e-filing process. They were, secondly, able to take in a 48-hour intake process and narrow that down to just a few minutes. So normally, filings were coming in, too much backlog, took a long time to get to. Now they've accelerated that throughput and velocity. They've also improved the quality control. So now data going into the case management system is more pristine. And what's interesting about this one is that they actually have a bot that runs for the county clerk's civil division. They also have a bot that runs for the county clerk's probate division. Civil division is 26 employees that handle the intake process. Probate's 22 employees. The bot is the number one resource out of both offices, and it's got a return for correction rate of about 1%. So really successful implementation of this technology. Another one, though, to kind of just maybe give a different perspective, more from like a business sense, is Palm Beach County, Florida. They handle about 1.8 million filings electronically each and every year. By implementing the solution, they save about $1.9 million net each year. They're operating 5 times faster with the bots than they do with humans, and about 42% of their filings are what we call lights out. What that means is a human never touches it. It goes from the start of the initiation process all the way to the completion without human interaction. But for the 58% that doesn't fall into that, the bots will go in and do the majority of the work, and then when they run into a decision point where that confidence threshold is not surpassed, then they'll present it back to the human and say, hey, I can't make this decision with the confidence level that you expect me to. Can you help me out with that? So even on the stuff that isn't wholesale complete, you're still getting some good efficiency gains by utilizing this technology. So a couple of great use cases on how to implement artificial intelligence and more specifically robotic processing automation. Now, we've been talking a lot about good use cases, good robots, if you will, but not all robots can be good. Some can actually be bad and be used for things that aren't really intended for the criminal justice system. When you start to dig into data, what you find is that court data is extremely valuable. There's a lot of different entities and a lot of different stakeholders that need access to this data, and most of it is for very good reasons. Take data analytics for legal professionals. There's a company that we partner with called Lex Machina who takes the data, then provides analytics and visualizations that's really specific to legal professionals to try to help them practice more, to be more efficient with their operations, to know where they should be practicing, where they probably shouldn't be practicing, to understand just basically how to be more efficient with their operations. You've got employment background checks. This one's a fascinating one. You've got companies like Checker and Inform Data that perform these employment background checks on individuals. Just an interesting use case. For the state of California, the unemployment per week can go up to $450, and it can take up to 26 weeks to actually get complete because of all the disparate offices. Now, on average, it's only about 2, but that equals about $900 if you take the high end there. And when you implement automation and artificial intelligence in this process, that 2-week cycle to do those background checks goes down to a few minutes. So you can save the state unemployment money by implementing a tool. Really cool. Matter management record sync. So on this one, we're all familiar with the courts case management system and how we keep track of all of the records for the courts, but the law firms have very similar systems. Many of them have what we call matter management systems, companies like Clio and Practice Panther. Those groups will go in and actually try to replicate the court record in their system so they understand what happens. They do form generation from there, they do submissions from there, but it's very important for those two records to be in sync. So when somebody electronically serves them a document, the typical way that comes through is through an email. And they go open their email and they read that document. They locally save it to either their shared drive or to their local machine. They go into their matter management system. They rekey all of that information in. They upload that document, which is a very laborious task. So by syncing up the court's case management system with their system, you can automate that process, simplify it, make it more efficient. It's very important on the next step that we'll talk about here in just a little bit around sealed documents and even expunctions later. And then last, you've got legal researchers, right? Whether it's legal aides, it's paralegals. These individuals need to do legal research. So having the data in a single location where they can go pull that information out and do that legal research, kind of like the federal PACER system, makes it a whole lot easier. It's a little different than spending some time in the law libraries like they have in the past, but it's a different way of doing it. So data is extremely valuable. The challenging thing is data is extremely valuable for maybe people that shouldn't have it as well. And so when you have bots that are going in and utilizing tools to scrape data, they don't have any regard to security. So a lot of times they'll go in and they'll grab the data, they'll grab the documents, they have it, they do whatever they want with it. But let's say later in that cycle, in court, maybe a judge says, hey, this document really has some sensitive information in it. I'm going to go ahead and seal it or lock it down. That information is never passed back to that group or that bot that captured that data. So now you have that data that's out there and somewhere, right, and may have unlawful eyes on it. Another example is when that case is expunged, they never send that notification. They never get it because they're grabbing it at the time that they have it and then they move on. So partnering with these entities to try to say, what is your use case? Is it a viable use case? Is it approved by the court? And if so, let's create some methods and some controls around that to where you're getting that information in a lawful way. I'll just give you a quick statistic. We have about 1.75 million authorized registered users on our platform that provides documents and court records. We've had to revoke the privileges of about 160,000 users, so just under 10% because they violated the terms and conditions, right? Anytime that we capture them or we predict them by utilizing AI, another great way of using it, and we're predicting or we're seeing, observing data harvesting behaviors, we will turn them off and we can't let them log back in, right? So imagine what happens. They naturally go create another email and the cycle starts all over again. So now we're kind of tightening the screws using artificial intelligence to help us with that. But by applying proper controls and proper methods, you can actually make a material, meaningful difference here. We can gain visibility into who's obtaining the court information, and we can ensure the right security measures are properly applied. When you protect a document, either mark it as sealed or confidential or even expunge it, we can send a notification to them and make sure that they do it on their system as well, so that it removes it from the public view, no matter what capacity it is. Gaining that visibility into who's actually using those records is important, because sometimes if you ever said, I had something out there for a moment in time and I shouldn't have put it out there, maybe it just wasn't set correctly in the case management system, then you go lock it back down. Understanding the audit trail of who's picked up that document and viewed it so that you could reach out to them is important. You can get higher revenue streams for the court by selling these documents and making them available on an authorized channel where they may be capturing them today in a different way. You can have efficient and authorized use of data partners through controlled APIs versus costly scraping. So what we've also observed is through these data harvesting techniques, it's not just one entity that's going in and pulling documents. They tend to do them in bulk and they tend to do them at the same time. What that means is that I've got these bots that are doing thousands upon thousands of searches at the exact same time. And in one use case, it's not a big deal, but when you have hundreds of them at the same time, it creates a performance challenge for the general public who's using the site to go look up their case to figure out what the next steps may be, or the legal professional who's trying to figure out what their next approach to that action is going to be. So controlling it allows for you to scale up that infrastructure and scale down that infrastructure to ensure that performance stays at the peak level and what would be expected by the users of the system, ensuring that they all have a good user experience. Okay, I'm going to pass it back over to Ellen. She's going to talk a little bit about how to effectively prepare you for your recorder office for the future, and then we'll tie a bow around it and close this out.
Thanks, Terry. All right, so I talk a lot about using data for strategic purposes and doing strategic planning with data. Most of the things that we've traditionally talked about in terms of strategic planning and data really are basically the same principles when it comes to preparing your court to use AI. So a lot of these things will probably be familiar, but hopefully that just makes you more excited to try it and gets us those 3 new hands that Terry was talking about when we revisit our question about whether or not you're excited to use AI at the end of the presentation. So what you can do today to get ready if you're not yet experimenting with AI in your court, it really comes down to knowing and understanding your data, because all of the different forms of artificial intelligence that we've talked about today really are just using data. They're receiving some sort of input, they're applying some rule set to that input, and they're producing some sort of output, whether it's a accepted document or an answer to a question. So when it comes down to it, it's garbage in, garbage out, which is a term all of you I'm sure have heard before, right? If your data is really in great shape, you're going to get a great output. If the data that you're receiving is not in good shape or is not sort of hygienic, as we talk about it, data hygiene, then you're not going to get as good of an output. It's the same thing if you think about the use case Terry just described with processing and e-filing, right? If someone scribbles all over the page, the bot won't be able to read it and it won't be able to be processed. If someone writes neatly or types in all of the boxes they're supposed to, then it can be understood by the AI and it can produce a correct output. So understanding your data, knowing that your data is really in good shape is really going to be the first step to feeling like you can use AI responsibly in your court. So that's your firm foundation for success, really is your data and making sure that you feel confident in the quality of your data. The second piece is going to be around policies. So making sure that everyone in your court knows how to interact with AI responsibly and ethically. Of course, there's even more questions around ethics for those of us in the legal world, because many people are barred attorneys that work in the court system and they have the rules of professional conduct to respond to, as well as their own normal ethical standards and the ethical standards of your organization. So policy is really a big deal here, and proactively setting policy is a big deal here. And then finally, understanding the right use cases. We'll talk more about this in a second, but the more high value your use case, the more the use cases that you try out first really impact the lives of people working in your court, the more you're going to see excitement, the more you're going to see an understanding, the more you're going to see people actually investing and making sure that AI is working for you in the right way. So from a data perspective, you really want to think about these 4 things in terms of data management. How accessible is your data? Can different folks look at it who are able to verify, yes, this looks accurate to what I did. Yes, this is an accurate reflection of the filings I processed yesterday. Is it able to be verified cleanly by people who work on the ground, or has it kind of been taken off and hidden somewhere where the only people who look at it are people who don't actually do the work that necessarily produces that data? And again, we always just encourage as much openness with data as possible within your system, because that's going to really give you that red flag when there's something wrong, red flag when something hasn't been entered correctly, because you have the folks that really know how it should look, saying, yeah, this is correct, this looks right. So finding ways to make your data accessible. At Tyler, one of the ways that we do that is that we have products like court analytics, e-file analytics that allow for everyone in your system to easily understand, what is the data showing us about court processing? What is it showing us about processing e-file? So having some sort of analytics that's really cleanly accessible to all the different users in your court is a huge way that you can make sure that your data is actually doing what it's supposed to do and recording what it's supposed to record. Making sure that data is high quality. And one of the things I really talk about that I feel like I'm a big data nerd, so I think my clients always are like, oh, well, you just want me to collect all the data in the world, don't you? And I'm like, no, don't collect all the data in the world. Only collect the data that you need. And part of that's for security reasons. Data has to be managed, data has to be kept secure, especially, the really sensitive data that we typically have in the court system. And so if you have data that you don't need, you still have that responsibility to keep it secure, to keep it confidential. So, collect the confidential data that you need to collect, but don't collect everything that you might ever want, because ultimately it gets to be too much to manage and you're increasing your risk of security issues. So out of the data that you collect, if you make sure that people understand, hey, this is why I'm asking you to enter this into this data entry. Like, I'm asking you to do that so we can produce this outcome, so we can produce this result. If you're able to draw that line for everyone that's entering data, then they're going to be better about entering it. If they know that it's being used, if they know that it's being looked at, and hopefully if they feel some connection to the way it's being used, if they feel like it helps them that this data is being used, they're going to have a much higher quality of data entry. And that's just human nature, right? I'm the same way. If I don't think anyone's ever going to look at something, I'm not going to do as thorough and complete of a job, because it's not important. No one's ever going to look at it. So you really want to make sure the data that you're putting out there is high quality, and that's because it's important to people. That's because they know it's being used and they understand why it's important. And that also comes down to that robust data governance. So having an understanding, again, across the entire court of how is this data being used, why is it being collected, what does each of these data points really mean? Data dictionaries, data rules and policies. Having all of that in place really helps people understand this is a serious part of my role to make sure that this data is up to date, is hygienic, is truthful. So all of that really comes down together. And I feel like I'm describing this in a way that makes it sound like it has to take a ton of time, but it really doesn't have to take a ton of time. There's definitely upfront work, making sure that these policies are set and making sure that everyone understands what kind of performance measures are being collected and the way the data is being used. But once things are actually kind of in place, you're able to develop things iteratively. So you're able to build on them and grow. What I always recommend is start small. Do one important thing, or maybe 2 important things with your data. And then once people see the benefit of that, once they trust that, then grow it. But don't try and come out the gate with collecting 1,000 different things and trying to create 80 different performance measures. It just doesn't set yourself up for success. But if you start small and you iteratively develop and you get that investment across the court in the data program, then I think this can be a really important, great way to involve everyone in the act of improving court processes. And then within that, you're able to develop that data literacy and the data skills that people need to understand and interpret the data and use it in their day-to-day life. Well, some great examples of this have come for us from our e-file analytics software, where we're able to really give people on the ground that access to data and understand how their e-filing data is being processed. And so everyone from clerks that are actually processing the e-filings to supervisors who are like working with all of those clerks are able to really dive in and say, where are things getting hung up, and really ask themselves data-driven questions and get answers. And so with all of that, as you develop those use cases, as you develop that accessible data, you'll see that these things tend to snowball on each other and feed each other. There's a really beautiful feedback loop that happens where the more you use data, the easier it is to use data and the easier it is to get people to invest in data. There's a saying that change moves at the speed of trust. So as people build that trust in data, they're able to really implement changes and changes in the way that they work that they can really start believing in and validating. So from a policy perspective, I just want to shout out a few things. One thing that I've seen already is that there are some courts in some states that are putting out AI policies. Specifically, I've seen mostly around generative AI so far. So I know Kentucky, Utah, I know the NCSC has an AI rapid response team that's putting out some really great policy information. So there are some folks that you can look to already that are putting out very interesting and thoughtful policy documents. But what really comes down to is making sure that what you expect people to do with AI in your courts is very well described. So one thing I've seen as a common thread across the new policy documents that are coming out is making sure that there is AI-focused training for your staff, and that they know when to use AI and when not to use AI. And they understand that piece I was talking about earlier of having a human partner that works with your technology, that's spot checking it, that's making sure it's doing what it's supposed to be doing, and really have it be an assistive tool, something that people are using to make their work faster and better, and not have it be a replacement for someone actually looking at the document or looking at the work that's being put out. So making sure that partnership is really there and clearly stated, and that the expectations for that are stated within your workforce is a huge deal. Another thing that is really important is understanding how the data that you're potentially, feeding into a large language model is being used, or, where is data being collected. So understanding those pieces and making sure that understanding is clear for your staff of here's what data is okay to feed into some sort of AI, and here's what data is not okay to feed into some AI. It's really critical. I think everyone's trying to operate in good faith here, but you can't expect every person, obviously, in your staff to have the same understanding of what is okay and not okay unless it's really proactively pushed out. So again, that's a place where we're seeing just like huge benefit from proactively setting policy. And then when it comes down to what this really ends up doing in your court is allows you to experiment with AI, which I would really encourage. Again, you want to do it safely, you want to do it thoughtfully, you want to do it responsibly. But one of the things that will happen is that folks will experiment with it often whether or not they're supposed to, right? So especially something like ChatGPT. Everyone knows about it. Everyone knows it can do things like summarize documents. Everyone knows it can do content generation. So if the folks that you're working with don't understand where to use that and how to use that, it's really hard to keep them from using it at this point. It's out there in the wild, so to speak. So really going in and making sure that everyone understands, hey, this is when, this is how, this is why, this is the training that you have to go through to do it appropriately. It really ends up saving a lot of time and pain long term, but it also gives people some sort of understanding of AI and what it does. So AI, as we talked about, there's some things it's amazing at that it does beautifully. There's other things that, at least at the present day, it doesn't do very well. So as your court learns about that, as your court understands, this is what we do want to use it for, this is what we don't want to use it for, the only way to really get down into that is to experiment. So it's having the policies that allow everyone to get that actual real-world experience with AI that gives them that knowledge that then they can take into the future as it continues to develop and as it continues to change. So again, this also kind of comes back to that piece around transparency, right? If everyone can talk about it, if everyone can share opinions about it, if everyone knows it's being used and how it's being used, you just have a better discussion. you have a more robust conversation, and you really get that common shared understanding of, hey, this is where it's at now, and this is where we think it has possibilities for our court into the future. So as you look at this and as you hopefully start thinking about how to experiment with AI in your court, I would just offer some questions that you can ask yourself as you look for these first use cases. And again, I talked earlier about start small and then build from there. So if you are interested in experimenting with AI, I really encourage you to find one thing, or again, two things that you want to do with AI. Try those things out, see how it goes, and then move on from there to expand your usage. And that's something, again, if you want to talk to any of the folks at Tyler about, we can help you figure out how that might be done if you're working with us already in your case management system or any other systems that you have. So one of those pieces is advanced task automation. So like I talked about earlier, think about where is there a set of rules being followed where someone is sitting there at their desk bored and having to kind of look at one thing, click, look there, click. If you have anything like that happening, might be a great place to automate that task and really relieve someone of a burden. We have a lot of employees in the court system that have been there a long time, and sometimes people get so sick of doing these small routine tasks every day. You might really increase some employee happiness if you can find a few things to automate where they no longer have to do that and can instead focus on human interaction with their colleagues, human interaction with the people that walk in the court system. That's usually what motivates people for these jobs much more than going in and clicking on the computer screen. So find ways that you can automate those tasks and release those folks to have those really valuable human interactions that build trust with our community, and you'll all be heroes, I promise. Data analysis, what are you trying to understand? Are there really valuable things that you've noticed that if I had this data, I could do this? If I understood the roots of this problem, I could solve it in these ways. If you're asking yourself questions like that, then looking into data analysis and what AI can help you do with data analysis is really what I'd recommend. And I hope that all of you have those questions because I really think data has that power within the entire court system. But I know that some folks, probably it's a really burning issue, and other folks maybe have other things that are top of mind. And either way, when you're looking at it, just think about what do I need to know here? And can I learn it from my data? And if the answer is yes, then I definitely recommend looking into data analysis as a way that AI can come into your court. And then finally, as Terry talked about, the data entry and the document processing, there are a ton of things that we do on a day-to-day basis in the courts that really are something that I think we can all imagine being automated. That Terry talked about, especially for e-filings, we really see so much promise in how quickly we can accept and reject documents, how quickly cases can then be moved forward based on that change to document processing. So there's just a ton of opportunity there, and maybe some of you are already doing that, maybe some of you aren't. But again, if you see any places where you're like, I'm actually not sure that a human needs to be looking at the screen and doing this, I could see this being described as a set of rules to follow, then that's a great place to look at your data entry and document processing and see what can AI do to really help me here. All right.
Right. Thank you, Ellen. Mm-hmm. All right, so I'm going to try to bring us full circle and close this out. I'm going to come back to the question that we asked at the beginning. Now you've heard it simplified a little bit, some practical use cases. How many are excited about implementing an AI solution in their court or office? All right. Good news. Not all of you, so we still have some that are a little anxious about it, and that's okay. But I'm glad to see more hands raised than before. So if I can leave you with this is what I would leave you with. AI is not an absolute replacement of employees. Think of it more of it's a tool, kind of like a calculator or Microsoft Excel. It's just another tool that goes into your tool belt. And if you use it correctly, it can give you an advantage. So what we hope that you can do is learn from the experience of some of your colleagues and be inquisitive and ask the questions of how can I implement AI and how can I utilize those tools in order to improve my court system? If you have questions about it or if we can be of any assistance, please let us know. We'll be here at the conference. We'll be here over over here on the side for a bit afterwards. Happy to serve you in whatever way that we possibly can. But if you have questions or you'd like to bounce some ideas off of us, we'd love to help however we can. Thank you guys. It's been a privilege and we really appreciate it.